R&B singer R. Kelly faced a dozen singers, dancers, and fans throughout his 5-week trial. Reporter Nina Polano was there day in and day out through the trial and when the jury issued its verdict. Listen to what she tells Nicholas Iovino.
Just a quick heads up to our listeners. While we won't get into explicit details, this segment will discuss allegations of physical and sexual abuse.
Free R. Kelly! Free R. Kelly! Free R. Kelly!
You just heard R. Kelly supporters chanting outside a courthouse in Brooklyn, New York. The 54-year-old singer, best known for songs like I Believe I Can Fly and Bump and Grind, was recently convicted in a federal racketeering trial. A 12-member jury found the R&B superstar ran his music recording business like a criminal enterprise, which he used to prey on young women and underage girls. On September 27th, after a 5-week trial, a jury found Kelly guilty on all counts. Before that verdict came in, I spoke with Courthouse News reporter Nina Polano, who covered the trial every day. Here's our conversation. Hi, Nina. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Nick. Good to be back.
So you last checked in with us in July, before the R. Kelly trial got underway. Can you remind us what charges the singer is facing?
Right. So in Brooklyn, the top count against R. Kelly is a racketeering charge, and that has 14 acts that are charged within it, including coercion and enticement of minors to commit illegal sex acts. Some of those are related to the Mann Act. And separate from the racketeering charge, he also has 8 separate Mann Act violations involving various anonymous alleged victims, and some of them also include minors. And the illegal sex acts either are related to the person's age, if they were under 18 when R. Kelly was much older than that, or they're related to the allegation that R. Kelly knowingly transmitted herpes to victims, basically without their consent to the circumstances of the situation, since they weren't aware of the risks involved.
Is that a crime, to knowingly transmit herpes to a person without their consent?
It is a crime under New York state law, so even though this is a federal trial and the charges are federal, that's how the transmission of herpes charges came into play, was through New York state health law.
And racketeering, or RICO, is a law that's traditionally been used to go after organized crime. How do prosecutors say those charges fit here?
That's true, and it's a good question because this has been the focus of a lot of the defense attorney argument, both during trial, and I've spoken to some of R. Kelly's former attorneys who really don't believe that the inner circle of employees and friends of R. Kelly that are kind of alleged as making up the enterprise, they don't believe that it's really a fit in this case. RICO has historically been used to go after, as you mentioned, organized crime, drug cartels, and mob-associated families. And there's been a lot of discussion about, even R. Kelly supporters who've been at trial sort of feel that charging one person as running an enterprise doesn't make sense.
One man ain't no enterprise. One man ain't no enterprise. The government needs to start telling lies. The government needs to stop telling lies.
It is interesting, and it is somewhat unusual, that R. Kelly is charged alone with running an enterprise. There are not co-conspirators, there are not co-defendants in this case. He's the sole person charged, and yet the government's case centers on the idea that he had all of these people working for him, helping him commit crimes. And the jury charge that the judge gave was very clear that in order for something to be an enterprise, it doesn't need to follow a specific hierarchy or structure or have decisions made in a certain way. It can be rather loose. It's rather loosely defined under the law. The government does not allege that a criminal enterprise existed. They allege that an enterprise existed that helped R. Kelly commit crimes.
What kind of evidence has the prosecution put forward to make its case here?
The bulk of the evidence has been testimony at trial. We have heard from 45 witnesses over more than a month of testimony. It's been a long haul, and a lot of those people are either accusers or employees, former employees of R. Kelly. They described both ends of a pattern that happened for decades, which basically involved R. Kelly scouting out or recruiting people at concerts or sometimes at malls or sometimes at McDonald's in Chicago. We heard from employees who say they were part of this recruiting and they carried around phone numbers and they helped to book travel and helped to make payments for hotels and airfare and those kinds of things to transport people to essentially come in and have sexual relationships with R. Kelly. We also heard from accusers who said that this was their experience and who described sexual and physical abuse. They described being held to really strict rules while they were staying with R. Kelly, like having to greet him and stand up every time he walked into the room. I think every accuser or near that said they were required to call him daddy. We also saw evidence of a lot of these allegations. So we saw plane tickets and we saw phone records. The government did bring in hundreds of documents and pieces of evidence to sort of support these stories that we were hearing in court.
I understand there was testimony on how R. Kelly exerted control over his alleged victims. What did witnesses have to say about that?
Multiple victim witnesses talked about being required to ask R. Kelly for permission to do pretty much anything, either directly or through one of his associates who would have to get confirmation from him that the guest or girlfriend was allowed to go to the bathroom, eat, leave the room or the tour bus that they were staying in. And we saw text messages sort of supporting that story.
What's been the strategy for R. Kelly's defense team in fighting these charges?
Throughout cross-examination and again in closing arguments, the strategy was really to suggest that the abuse that was being alleged simply had never happened. Repeatedly, attorney Deborah O'Canick asked victims sort of why they had stayed in this relationship, or rather confirmed that they had stayed in this relationship despite what they were saying had happened to them. He asked about whether they participated in the documentary Surviving R. Kelly that sort of spurred these charges. He asked how much money they got for participating in that documentary. And he sort of brought home that point in his closing arguments where he mentioned Surviving R. Kelly and then suggested that these accusers were surviving off of R. Kelly and really were just looking for a payout once the relationship that they were in, that the defense attorneys say was all consensual, once those relationships had ended.
What were the allegations related to the late R&B singer Aaliyah, and how did they come into the trial?
The charge against R. Kelly related to Aaliyah is that he bribed a public official in order to get a fake ID so that he could marry her when she was 15 years old and R. Kelly was 27, because he believed that Aaliyah was pregnant at the time. So, of course, Aaliyah passed away 20 years ago and wasn't there to testify, but we also heard from another accuser who said that she saw R. Kelly engaged in a sexual act with Aaliyah when she was no older than 14 years old.
So these accusations go back to the early to mid-90s. If they're true, how did R. Kelly get away with it for so long?
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the kind of cultural reckoning that's happened alongside the legal charges that have been brought against R. Kelly in recent years. And the government has certainly made the point that this is the kind of pattern of abuse that existed and was allowed to exist in plain sight. And again, they made the point that these crimes happened, this abuse happened because R. Kelly had help, because he had this inner circle, he had, you know, the fame and money that afforded him the power to hire people, to keep them close, to at times threaten them so that they stayed loyal to him or insist that they'd pick a side if it seemed like they might dissent, and really just used that power to act with impunity, as the government argued, for decades.
After my conversation with Nina, the verdict came in. It happened a lot more quickly than expected, after less than 2 days of jury deliberations. I caught up with Nina one more time to get an update on the case after R. Kelly was found guilty on all counts. Hi, Nina.
Hello again.
So we're catching up again after just a few days. Were you surprised how quickly the jury reached a verdict?
You know, it was hard to get a really clear sense of the jury, in part because they were kept anonymous and partially sequestered, so we didn't see much of them throughout trial. We were in an overflow room, so couldn't see how they reacted to the evidence. But the fact that after 9 hours, given the 6 weeks of testimony and all the information they had to go through, the amount of time it took, to me, suggests that there wasn't too much disagreement.
What's been the reaction of R. Kelly's lawyers and the prosecutors and the victims?
I was able to catch up with R. Kelly's lawyers right after the verdict was read, and his lead defense attorney, Devereaux Canick, told me that not only was he disappointed in the verdict, but he was more disappointed in the prosecution for bringing these charges in the first place. He repeated, as he did in arguments, that there were inconsistencies in the witness testimony that he felt should have invalidated this case.
They cherry-picked a version and ran with that version. They totally ignore the inconsistencies that all of these witnesses gave in their debriefing. They tried, and I guess they successfully did it, was to massage it. But it's a situation wherein I don't know if I'm more disappointed in the juror's verdict or the government's action in this case.
Prosecutors spoke outside of court and really talked about the significance of this legal proceeding sort of in the cultural context and what it means for people who are victims, people who may feel voiceless, getting some sense of justice. And the acting U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of New York made a comment about how even if it's many years later, the long arm of the law will catch up to you. And that was sort of the theme.
In rendering its verdict today, the jury delivered a powerful message to men like R. Kelly. No matter how long it takes, the long arm of the law will catch up with you.
What's next for R. Kelly?
The judge set R. Kelly's sentencing date for May of 2022. And between now and then, of course, his attorneys may file a motion to overturn the conviction. His attorneys have already suggested that they'll plan to appeal, which would be something that happens, later down the road. In this trial, there were 9 counts against him, and each carried a possible sentence of 10 or 20 years. So he's looking at potentially decades in prison, potentially life in prison, based just on the charges in New York. Regardless of what happens in Brooklyn, he faces state and federal charges still in Chicago and in Minnesota and a few other investigations. So it's really just the beginning, not the end of a long legal battle for him.
All right, well, thanks so much for coming back and updating us on the outcome.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, take care.
You too.
Old fans are torn. Look at YouTube comments for R. Kelly's 1998 song, If I Could Turn Back the Hands of Time. Following the verdict, one fan wrote, quote, "So sad the things you did. Your songs are still the best though." And another said, "I bet he wishes he could turn back the hands of time. Now he's been found guilty."